Hello and welcome to Driver's Therapy. Today we're going to be tackling an issue that is well known in the 981 GT4 community and other models as well, which we'll be touching on here in a bit. And that is going to be the infamous strut tower failure on Porsche's GT4, 981 and 991 models. Now, I did so much research, and I'm going to be crediting, mentioning, and talking about the website that I got a lot of this information from. First off, I'm a big fan of Rennlist, and it's a great website if you're a Porsche owner. If you know about the website, awesome. If you don't, I highly recommend you go check it out. All right, guys, let's go ahead and jump right in. So I did an extensive amount of reading to the point where my eyes hurt last night. I read every single post on Rennlist about this topic. And by the time I was done, I felt like I was working at a law firm and doing a lot of research on a case that was pretty much being buried by both facts, assumptions, opinions, and a bunch of unanswered questions. So before we start, for some of you who don't know what the strut tower failure is on Porsche's specific models, it's when essentially the cast aluminum rips off of the body and the strut tower pops out, most of the time hits the hood, and the car is done. Now, when I was looking at my GT4, I did read about this, but it was just quick skim reading, and I knew that it was a potential problem. But this time around, I wanted to make sure that I did an extensive research on it and try to give you guys the best interpretation of what I read. So first off, I'm going to throw out some facts here, and I want to clear up any maybe anxieties that's within the GT4 community or anyone who might be susceptible to this issue. And for the GT4 models themselves, the 2016 981 models, there was roughly 2,500 slotted or limited run of the GT4. And it is said that about 1,500 of those were in the United States. Now, after doing some research, I think that there is close to maybe, I would say on the internet, about 5 to 10 occurrences or pictures or people stating that their strut tower failed, and just also other people's pictures from around the world. And I'm also including a few of the GT3 and 991 pictures that I saw. Now, I went ahead and I bumped up that number to 25, which is almost doubling it. And that's for the people who might have had the issue, didn't post it, isn't active on the internet. And I went ahead and bumped it up to a safe 25 occurrences. Now, the reason why I did 25 occurrences is because it's going to give you an idea of the percentage of cars that have failed. So if there was 2,500 limited run manufactured GT4s and only 25 suffered the strut tower failure, then that would be 1%. Now, don't get me wrong, it is something that I am completely terrified and can happen based on what I read, but I think it's a perfect storm, and we're going to be addressing some of the things that people thought of or think that is the cause, and then I'm going to tell you what I personally think based on what I've read and go from there. So some of the people that had these situations, to be honest with you, they were a little vague. And the reason why is because when the strut tower kind of blows up or the issue happens, from what I read, Porsche did not warranty it. They did not goodwill it. If you're not familiar with the goodwill word, that means that even though you're out of warranty, they're going to cover it. Essentially, Porsche did not take responsibility for it, and they consider it an external factor. So majority of these situations were handled by insurance claims. And whenever people were questioning people who had these instances that occurred to them, they were vague. And I don't blame them, because if they wrote something like, yeah, I was doing 100 miles per hour and you know, I hit a pothole, and you know, the insurance company does their research and finds that they wrote that, because insurance companies do sometimes go a little above and beyond to see if a claim is valid or not. So they kept a lot of the people that were questioned about the factors surrounding the strut tower failures were vague. And that did not help people who were seeking data and trying to find why this happened, because I don't think a lot of it might have been factual, because they weren't going to tell anyone on the internet. They weren't going to write it and say like, yeah, I was doing 120, hit a pothole and blew out my strut tower, because their claim wouldn't be valid because they were doing something illegal. So just to give you guys an idea of the type of research I did and the way that I approached it. So after doing some more research where people actually were a little bit more open, and that's because they were at a track day, because definitely there were some occurrences during the track day and it's just some occurrences while they were driving, you know, in the normal public roads. And the track day people were a lot more open, a lot more willing to give precise information about the factors surrounding the strut tower failure. And a lot of it came to the fact that they hit a berm, or they went off of the rumble strips and hit a pothole, and essentially just kind of that incident happened at the high speed. They dropped the wheel and it blew through the strut tower. Now, after hearing all these occurrences, people started to do a lot of research, and this is where I'm going to use my phone, and I want to credit some of the best people who commented. Now, there's people who were just questioning, speculating, but there were some very intelligent people commenting on Rentless, and I want to make sure I give them a shout out and also give you guys an opportunity to know who they were. And it's going to be Okie981, OKIE981, and 993TT. But I have to say that Okie981 was on a mission to try to find out why this happened. He was so much on a mission that he was actually trying to buy the parts separate from the car to do some structural analysis on it and do some metal stress tests and see what's going on with these particular cast iron parts. Now, one of the things you guys need to know about the strut tower failure is that it is actually crazy that that portion of the car is actually consists of rivets and an epoxy and a cast aluminum. And another crazy thing that I found out based on reading and doing research, and these are facts, these aren't opinions here, is that the GT4 shock towers were reinforced in the back and not in the front. And yes, that made everybody shake their head, because that doesn't make any sense at all, right? Why reinforce the back? We know that the engine is closer to the back wheel, but still, the strut towers were not reinforced in the front. Second of all, whenever you look at the way that the cast aluminum was designed, the inverted suspension or dampener for the GT4, if you don't know what inverted means, just take a regular shock setup and just flip it over, essentially came up with two red flags. One of the questions that nobody could answer was, does the GT4 with the inverted suspension have a bump stop? A lot of people think it doesn't based on a diagram that they showed for the parts list, and that would be an issue. And we'll get real deep into why that would be an issue. And then second of all, the top hat of the GT4, which is different from the regular 981, is actually offset to where the cast aluminum strut tower molding should essentially be. And what I mean by that is, if you took, let's say, a bottle cap and inverted it, and the cap itself, you try to screw it on, but you kind of were offset from it, that's what I mean, and you couldn't screw it on. The suspension on a GT4 for, I guess, for adjustments, for camber adjustments, the actual top hat is actually offset, which people made the assumption that that would put more load on the area that is not making contact with the cast aluminum, versus if it was making, if the top hat was flush and making full contact with the strut tower mount. So essentially people were saying that that top hat is causing a pinpoint pressure point on that structural cast aluminum. Now, I know some of you guys are like, man, there's a lot of like structural engineering stuff going on, and believe it or not, there was actual engineers and structural engineers who wanted to find out what's going on. So it's kind of a mystery. So after doing some more research, a few people who had the incidents said that they lowered their vehicle, and that was starting to be a common denominator, is that people have messed with their geometry of their GT4. Now let me tell you, they are 100% right. If you buy a track car, you should be able to mess with the geometry all you want, and it shouldn't result in a strut flying through the cast aluminum. Yes, they are allowed to do that, but it looks like the people who lowered their car and messed with and had a more of aggressive camber setting were more prone to that issue based on taking those factors and seeing who had those issues versus who did it. But I want you guys to know what happens and how much it costs if you have this situation. Well, if your strut tower pops out, apparently you could drive, the steering wheel is gonna feel weird and light, but you could drive to the nearest exit or to the pit stop, and essentially you're gonna have to go to a Porsche dealership. They're not gonna Goodwill it from what we've heard. Your insurance company is gonna inspect it, and then they're gonna have to order a tub and all that strut tower assembly units. And apparently that's on back order, and then a shop is going to have to put it on. And apparently Porsche has specific regulations and specifications that you have to do it. So that's a whole other big hurdle. And it costs about $30,000 from the body shop to the insurance company, and it takes something like 6 months to a year to even complete. So yeah, that sounds like a complete nightmare. And just to give you an idea what happens, I've given you kind of a few ideas of why this might happen. Improper suspension geometry, lowered vehicle, hitting something at high speeds and just the car being too low and not having enough room to transfer that energy. And then somebody said, which I would put the least merit on, that it's a safety issue, because if you blow through the shock tower on a high impact situation, you won't destroy the frame, you'll just destroy the shock tower, which in my opinion really doesn't make sense. But in the same time, it might be valid because there is such thing as cars that crush to save the driver. So I just want to give you guys all the data that I found out. Now, why do I think it happened? Well, from what I've been seeing, one comment stood out to me the most. Somebody said if you lower your GT4, add some camber, put some heavier aftermarket wheels, and have steel brakes, you have the perfect recipe for the strut tower failure. And the reason why is because if you think about normal physics of how it transfers, something has to give. And just in life, anything that's stronger is gonna essentially pass it off to the weaker point. So if you hit something and there is no suspension travel, and your tires, wheels, steel brakes, suspension assembly pushes that force through the dampener, which is not dampening because there is no dampening length or travel, that's the correct word, travel, then that force is going to translate to the top hat, which is metal. And like other people have said, that metal portion is going to make contact with part of the cast aluminum instead of it sitting flush because of the geometry. And of course, that force is all going to be put on cast aluminum, which isn't technically as strong as something as steel. I know that might be, that's something that I'm not 100% sure on, but that's what somebody said. But I thought I'd make that statement in case I'm wrong. And then boom, you have your issue. Now, I think about myself like you guys think about yourself. I want to protect myself and I want to make sure I don't have any issues. So after doing some research, I realized that I drive my car, I have carbon ceramic brakes, I have stock height, I believe. I looked at my wheels, I don't have very aggressive camber, but one of the things I don't use is I don't use the sport suspension button. It's just because, why? I'm just driving around, And I'm thinking that if you added the recipe, what I said earlier, and added the stiffer suspension, you've just added a huge issue. And I know a lot of you guys would be like, if I can't use my sport suspension, why do I have a GT4? Well, I'm not saying you can't, but what I'm saying is, this is my hypothetical assumption, is for people with carbon ceramic brakes, which is a lighter mass and stock height, and you don't use the stiff suspension button, then you're actually going to have quite a bit of travel, quite a bit of dampening. And if you do hit a pothole or if you do hit something, there's going to be a little bit more give. Now, somebody said stronger spring rates might help that. I think that's absolutely incorrect because essentially they're trying to prevent bottoming out, right? Transferring that force directly to the cast aluminum portion of the car. Well, in my opinion, I'm thinking that if you have the correct dampening with the correct springs, not too strong or too, what's that word? It's kind of evading me right now, but not too stiff, then it's gonna essentially buff, right? Buffing. So in my opinion, I just think that you could run your sport suspension, you could do anything, but I think the biggest issue is preventing travel. And that's if you lower your car, do aggressive geometry, if you're running the hardest dampening setting and the hardest dampening spring, then yeah, you're gonna transfer that whole energy to the top part of the car. Now, of course, by the time I was finished reading everything, my conclusion was like everybody else. No one knows. One of the things that stood out to me that was more like a Netflix documentary than something more realistic was that the guy who was trying to buy the parts to actually do the stress test and structural analysis on the parts, he couldn't buy them. Like Porsche wouldn't let him buy those parts. Of course, there's many reasons why, you know, not available, supply chain, you know, IP, you know, but of course it makes you think like, why couldn't he do those tests on that part? And I wanted to provide 2 more data points for you guys. There was never any official Porsche literature or documents or information that was put out there. The only thing that I found was something from the PCA, which is the Porsche Club of America, and it was for the PCA Club Racing, and they posted up that starting with the 981 and 991 models, Porsche had used a cast aluminum front shock tower. Excessive loading of the front suspension can cause the aluminum to fracture. And then they go on to tell about a part that might help. And based on the part that they provided, that was a big discussion in the forums as well on Renlist. And to be honest with you, a lot of people said that that part really wouldn't help. But I thought I'd give you guys that information. And also here recently, I made a video about a guy who drove his car, or is still driving his car, all the way past 200,000 miles on his GT4, a 981, and he had a strut tower failure, but he's done over 140 plus track days. And just to give you an idea that maybe it, you know, he did all those track days and never had an issue, and then he did on the highway or on the road, from what I read. So just kind of giving you all the data so you guys can make your own decision. Now, going back to the beginning of the video, if there's 2,500 GT4s and 1% has this issue, then it is the minority. But I thought I'd give you guys the information that I found out. How am I going to use this information? Well, I'm going to make sure I watch out for potholes. I'm not lowering my GT4. I mean, I'm not a track guy anyways. I know it's lame, whatever. I love my car. I love canyons. I love driving. But I'm not going to increase the probability by stiffening my car, because you will have an issue if you essentially do all those recipes. And you're gonna have a problem if you stiffen up your car and lower it to the point where it just can't transfer that force. Well guys, I hope you found this informative. Again, big shout out to Renlist, great website. Oki981, never met him, but all I could say is that that user on Renlist is awesome, and he tried to stick to this topic and get as much information as he could. And 993TT, that user seems to be very intelligent, and I loved his comments because he was very intellectual when he commented. It was, it's always cool to meet people like these. They were trying to solve the issue. Unfortunately, there was not a conclusion or a precise outcome to what causes this. All right, guys, thank you for watching. We appreciate you. Hope this was helpful. You take care, and we'll talk to you soon.